Greetings and salutations. This is Hugh Jarsz, and I'm coming to you, the biggest YouTuber ever. I've got to say that bit first. And I'm coming to you live today from Baldrick's Underpants because we're doing history with PhD Tony. Welcome, Tony.
Welcome. Let me just try and straighten up my camera a bit. I'm not sure that I'm level, but anyway, how are you, Phil?
Are you flat?
Yeah, I'm not flat. I'm very, very round. How are you, Hugh?
I'm good. It's a bit of a busy day at work today, but it's good to relax and kick back and travel to the past tonight with you and to learn all sorts of things.
Yes, indeed. Though we're passing out of my area of speciality. This is I'm a very early medieval historian, so more into the Anglo-Saxon and Viking eras. So we're leaving my comfort zone already. All
right. Well, I'd be interested in doing one on those as well. The Anglo-Saxons in particular are fascinating. And I'd also like to do one on the Scottish kings as well. They have a fascinating history as well.
They do. They do indeed. Some of them are popularized by Shakespeare, obviously. Anyway,
yes.
So
we're definitely going to get into the Shakespearean kings tonight. That's for sure.
Yes.
We've got Monkey in the Works in the chat, who's a member, and Daryl M, both members. So welcome to you guys.
Welcome, gentlemen. It says that we've got 3 watching now, but I guess I may be one of them. So, you know, that's I may be cheating. But yeah. So shall we kick on? We got up to John of England, John the First, John the Only. The worst ever.
Start with the worst ever. That's a good way. Well, we're going to finish with the worst ever. Sorry, we're going to start with the next one, which is probably the second worst bit ever.
I'm
not sure I'm getting the right
there's
screen.
Some stiff competition, but Henry III is up there. Yeah.
Did I get the right screen, or am I just sharing? Oh no, we got it. Good.
Yeah,
that worked. Good. All right, so Henry III, he was definitely his father's son, I think. He wasn't... Pie Parrot, hello. Pie Parrot's in the chat. Haven't seen her for a while.
Oh, hi, Pip. How are you?
And, g'day, Cobbers. Okay. Does anyone ever say that anymore? We did do it when I was a kid, sort of occasionally, but only with the old people. So
yeah. Yes, well, Pip will be very excited by the news that we're considering going after some Scottish history in the future. So she's from that part of the world. But Henry III, as we discussed last time, his reign started when he was quite young. John died, and he was there was basically a council of regents. Run by William Marshall, that ran the country on his behalf for a long time until he asserted himself. And he might have been better off leaving it with them because he doesn't seem to have done that well.
No, I mean, like his dad spent a lot of time trying to hold on to the lands in France in particular. And the barons didn't like that because they had to pay for it. He taxed the barons to pay for it. And that's what led to Magna Carta and that sort of thing. And Henry III tried to do pretty much the same thing and with the same result. He had his own Magna Carta in 1225, which, his dad, he just ignored.
I think there were like three versions of Magna Carta that he signed. There was one that he signed in front of the barons. There was one that he sent off to the Pope, and there was another one after that. So he signed, and they're all subtly different documents, but with the same central message. He wanted to conquer back the lands that his dad had lost, and he failed utterly at everything except creating a massive debt. But he was notable for one other item, which was being insanely anti-Semitic. He introduced a lot of taxes and laws aimed at the Jews of England, and in fact had to tighten them up in order to keep the barons on side later in his reign. So it was good. I'm much better now, thanks, Pip. It was a bad day during the day, but feeling much better. And hello to John Rapp for joining the chat.
Yeah, but yeah, to see John Rapp. That's what, but he's never going to be a moderator because we know what happens when he becomes a moderator. Yeah, so as I said, they're extorted English Jews. So Simon de Montfort was a Frenchman who came over and joined the court of Henry III, and they became best buddies at first, because Simon de Montfort was sort of like the guy that Henry III always wished he was. He was good at being a soldier and hunting and all that sort of thing. And remember Henry came to the throne when he was a young lad, so he never really had a father figure other than William Marshall was probably getting a bit on at this point, even though William Marshall was the greatest knight ever. So it would have given the right values, but it was sort of a bit past it, I guess, to be a dad. You sort of want to be at least a generation, or at least only a generation apart. So when he saw Simon de Montfort, they got on very well, and but that came back to bite him later on. By the end of, let's go back to his issue, because this is relevant. Henry had a son, Edward I, and we'll hear a lot about him in just a few minutes. And had other children as well. Margaret, Queen of Scots, was notable. It's interesting that all these kings and queens are either married to the French or the Scots. And it depends on who they're more afraid of at the time. If they're afraid of the Scots, they're marrying the French, and vice versa. It's just the way it works through history, it seems, at this period. So I was getting on to, so there was a rebellion which Simon de Montfort led with Henry's queen, from memory. Oh, no, I'm confusing him with Edward II.
No, you are.
Yes, and he led a rebellion, and he actually captured Henry III. And it's Edward I, he was Prince Edward then, Prince of Wales. He proved himself to be a good soldier, but at the Battle of Lewes, he got a little bit overzealous and ran off and left his dad unprotected. And so Simon was able to capture Henry III, and then at the final battle, they dressed up Henry III in Simon de Montfort's uniform, whatever uniform he had, and pushed him out on the battlefield. So in the hope that if Simon lost against Edward, when Edward came back for him, then the king would be killed as a soldier of de Montfort's. After the Battle of Lewes, both Henry III and Edward I, Prince Edward, were taken into custody by Simon de Montfort, but they weren't like locked up in a dungeon or anything. They were just sort of always surrounded by guards, and they would enjoy sport with each other. And Edward I got away from his guards by saying, "Oh, let's play a game. Let's find out who has the fastest horse." And when he found the fastest horse, he kept going. He wasn't any dummy, that's for sure.
No, he wasn't.
And of course, they couldn't catch him because they didn't have the fastest horse. So.
Yes.
Oh yes, Darryl Emery reminds me we've already had the conversation that Sir Sick is the greatest knight. Might be greatest in circumference.
He might be currently the greatest knight. I think that. But whether he's the greatest knight ever is perhaps still open to some discussion, especially since he's up against William Marshall. But it's worth noting that the name Simon de Montfort is not one that the Simon de Montfort you're talking about is the 6th Earl of Leicester, Simon V de Montfort, to distinguish him from all of the other Simon de Montforts that are littered through English and French history of this era. They seem not to have been very imaginative with their choice of names. And so there was a Simon de Montfort at the original signing of the Magna Carta. There was a Simon de Montfort in the Albigensian Crusades. there are lots of Simon de Montforts. They're not all the same people. So anyway, the other notable thing about Henry III was that he had a very long reign. 53 years, which was a record for a medieval king, for an English medieval king.
Yeah.
And but eventually did the decent thing and passed the reign on. I think he was estranged from his wife. He wasn't necessarily getting on well with anybody by the end, but yeah, that's fairly typical. He was John's son, so
yeah. And that's what we'll move on to Edward the First then, because that's what makes it so amazing that Edward the First was so good. I think Edward the First took after his great grandfather more than his grandfather.
Yes,
he had the temper, at least. They all had the temper, but he was much more had much more military prowess. He was much better to rule as a soldier, which is what you need to be if you're a medieval king, really. It was kind of like a prerequisite.
Yeah. Edward I, Malleum Scotti, which is a Latin name for Hammer of the Scots and Longshanks, because he was apparently quite tall.
Yeah.
6'3",
average height was about 5'8" at the time, so
yeah,
he would have stood above their people.
So he was not a man you wanted to anger. Edward I, he'd forgive the first time, but if you play it around again, he would come and he would crush you. And he did it in spectacular style to Wales.
Yes.
He managed to bring Wales firmly under English rule, and pretty much bankrupted England in order to build a series of castles. Some of the most famous castle building of the medieval era.
Many of them still standing today. They're beautiful castles.
Yeah, many of them. I think most of them are still standing today, and they're considered sort of the way medieval castles should be. But they're actually spectacular examples of castle building. In that capacity, but in order to get the money up, he tightened a lot of laws and regulations and administrative detail. So he administratively and legally, he did a lot of rationalizing and sort of streamlining of the system to make it cheaper to run and to make it more effective at raising money for him. So generally, a pretty good medieval monarch, not necessarily the nicest of individuals.
No, but effective.
But very effective, yes.
Yeah, and that's why I gave him a B+. He wasn't like he was a benevolent dictator or anything like that, but he got the country sort of pretty much sorted out. He basically ended all the battles they had to do in Wales for centuries to come. Not all of them, but most of them. And he thought he'd do the same with Scotland, which was a bit of a mistake, really. He died on campaign.
I think if he'd lived longer, Scotland wouldn't have been a mistake. But yeah, given that he died and handed command over to Edward II, bit of a mistake. It's easy to say these things in retrospect, but I think if he'd stayed in charge for another decade, Scottish history would have been very different. But he did.
Yes,
so,
possibly.
Yeah,
because it was mainly he was trying to do it the easy way, because they had the Scottish interregnum at the time, which eventually resulted in, at the end, Robert the Bruce, which was the worst possible outcome from the English point of view, and at least for Edward II's point of view. But he was trying to put himself as overlord. So, okay, I'll tell you who your next king's going to be, but you got to make me your over king. So and
he was that was a bit dickish. Let's just say it. So his aunt, I think, his sister married off. Sister got married off to the Scots, or was it his aunt? One of the two. but she died. But she and her husband passed away, and so they thought, oh, wouldn't it be nice? We're having a bit of difficulty working out who should be king. Let's ask Edward I at judge. He's going, well, the only reason you're asking me is because really I'm in charge, so I'm king. And that wasn't the result that the Scots wanted, and for obvious reasons. It's also worth pointing out a little bit of an irony here in that after the invasion of England by William the Conqueror and the harrowing of the North, which we discussed in the previous episode, there was an exodus of English nobility into Scotland, as a result of which Scottish English is actually more English than the English we speak, which has been Frenchified. So
yes,
words such as ban or kirk, those are actually proper English pronunciations that we no longer have.
More Anglo-Saxon, yeah.
The Old English, and so there's a little bit of an irony in that the English went to Scotland. English nobles went to Scotland, and they kind of took over Scotland. And then Normans wanted to take over Scotland because they already had England. So it was kind of a weird fight with weird national identities. But for those fans of Scottish nationalism and why haven't you left England behind? Come on, those guys are losers. Look at the Ashes. Got my shirt on.
You've seen my community page, yeah.
but it was he was prepared to pick a fight, and I'm sure sort of he justified it to himself that he was chosen by God, as all monarchs at the time were, and he was bringing Scotland into the bosom of his English empire where it would be much better off. The Scots didn't necessarily see it that way, and nor should they now. So anyway, as you say, passed away on campaign. Famously, his bones were carried ahead of the army as they continued. He gave instructions that his body should be carried in front of the army so that he could continue leading them even after death. But sadly, that didn't happen. Well, it did happen, but it didn't work.
And his son couldn't be bothered, to be honest.
Yeah, let's move on to him.
Well, I just wanted to look, two more points I wanted to make relating to Edward II. Really, Edward I had 5 daughters before he managed to have any sons, and then he had 3 in a row. So Henry VIII got angsty after just 1 daughter. So at least Edward had that going for him.
Well, Henry VIII had more of an idea what happened when there was no male heir. I just want to quickly interpolate that Edward I was also very protective of his mother. At one stage, his mother's barge got pelted by Londoners as it was coming down the Thames, and the Londoners were very lucky to escape a lesson in "Don't piss off Edward I." He had to be talked out of it, and it took quite a bit of effort. So he was very protective of his mum. Whether or not you consider that a good thing or not, I don't know. But your second point.
Oh, the second. Yes. So one of the castles he built in Wales was Carnarvon Castle. I know that's not the correct Welsh pronunciation. But in there, that's where Edward II was born. And he presented Edward II as the very first Prince of Wales to take over from Llewellyn, who he killed the year before, and said, "Here is a Prince of Wales who speaks no English." And that was why Edward II was fit to rule Wales when the time came. And they couldn't really argue against that, could they? So because that was the case. So let's move on to Edward II, and I'm pretty sure I didn't bother changing the score. I think this is more a
you
C-.
cannot be serious with a B plus.
Yes, I think that was his dad's, and I just didn't change it. So C- maybe.
Yeah, all right.
So yeah, Edward of Carnarvon, as I just said, he was only 43 when he died. He was the first king, the first Prince of Wales, as I just mentioned, and the first king to abdicate.
Yeah.
My mouth isn't working today. So he married Isabella of France, one of the princesses of France, and this is the first king that they sort of have a rumor was gay. And I think he wasn't just gay; he might have been bi, because he had several children. So by Isabella, not just the one. So to me, that's more than gay.
Children aren't really an indicator. A lot of people.
Well, I'm saying he's bi.
A lot of gay people have children because they feel a lot of social pressure too. Doesn't necessarily count one way or the other. So, but there are a lot of William Rufus we discussed last time.
I forgot about him.
Some suggestion that he was gay, but people in the Middle Ages didn't particularly have that mindset, and
no, they didn't really understand it as a concept.
Whether he was or not is sort of speculation. A lot of this stuff gets spread as rumor and innuendo by later historians trying to discredit somebody they didn't like, and so you've got to take it with a pinch of salt. But it was widely rumored that he was effeminate, and he certainly had male favorites.
Piers Gaveston in particular.
Yeah, that he invested a lot of power and a lot of wealth and a lot of titles in, and in doing so, he alienated a large portion of his own nobility, because this guy was basically nobody. There's a Tusk. I'm not certain that I agree that your statement is accurate. And if
the shellfish bit is a bit that confuses me. Is that a bit like sleeping with the fishes?
I'm not sure how that. I do like the suggestion that shellfish are not animals.
Well, I was thinking that too. Yeah.
But
humans are animals too. We're not rocks or plants. So
they're not plants. So
yeah. One of the big things in Edward II's reign was the Despencer family, which he basically brought in and used as henchmen, and everyone else hated that because they had power over them, and they thought that shouldn't be the way. Because I think it's because the Parliament wouldn't give him any money to raise an army to put down rebellions and things. So the Despencer family said, "Yeah, we'll do it." So it's like he had his own little private mafia, you might say. And you don't want to talk more? Okay, good. Yes, in the end, they forced him to abdicate. Oh God! In real life, I say that word perfectly every time. For some reason, because I'm on air, I get it wrong. Abdicate. Because Roger Mortimer and Queen Isabella, they had a thing going, and they wanted to get rid of Edward II so that her son Edward III, the future Edward III, could take over. So, I don't think we can mention this, especially with Tusk in the chat, that Edward II lost to the Scots at Bannockburn in that famous battle by Robert the Bruce, or led by Robert the Bruce. It was quite an amazing thing.
Famously lost quite a few battles, I think.
Much like John and Edward III.
Yeah,
Henry III.
Yes, so a lot of his favorites, those favorite. He went through a succession of favorites. There was Piers Gaveston, there was Hugh Despencer, and basically there was a lot of muscle exerted, a lot of influence exerted to banish these people because they were extremely unpopular amongst the nobility, and he became less and less popular because he came back to defend them and reinstate them. So having had them kicked out, people had to live with them again, which kind of eroded his position. And eventually his queen and Roger Mortimer set him aside to get his 14-year-old son installed on the throne. And and there's a rumor here as well that he was murdered. It seems highly probable that he was, though.
Yeah. Although the method is probably unlikely.
Yeah, the method that is recorded is a red hot poker inserted in the rectum. This, I don't think he's the only person rumored to have been killed this way, but yeah, that's the story that we've got from some near contemporaneous sources. But again, how much weight you put on that is as a matter of personal discretion.
Well, actually, historians don't think there's any evidence for that, really. That was written like decades after his death. It could be just a rewriting of history. So,
yeah, it's one of the difficult things with history is that you need to understand that you don't have data resolution as good as highly resolved as you would like. Some stuff was written down, but it was written down by somebody with a particular point of view. It might have been somebody who was trying to be honest, but didn't actually know that much and was getting their data from somewhere else. They might have had some particular moral story that they were trying to tell. This person lost because they were immoral, not the other way. Yeah. So they invent the immorality to justify their position. This person was, a lot of people who recorded history at this time were monks. This person was not on my monastery side during this particular contract dispute. So I'm going to say whatever I like about him. I'm going to slag the shit out of him because I can. So you need to be aware when you're reading, even primary sources, that they're written down. They're by somebody who may have had an agenda, may have been ignorant, may have been using some sort of literary norm that we accept as real now, but actually was a figure of speech of the time. So you've got to be very, very careful, which is why professional historians, it's a hard job.
It is, and especially at this time when records are scant and hardly anyone knew how to read. So they were just doing it mainly for political reasons, what they recorded. So yeah, it's always tainted by that. So I think we covered him. He was basically, when he abdicated, they shoved him away and encouraged him to die as soon as possible, and he did fairly soon after that, and that left the path clear for Edward III. And
yes.
In fact, probably I might bump him up to an A- actually, because a lot of people consider him the greatest English king ever, especially in this period.
Yeah, I'm not certain that I'd rate him necessarily higher than Henry II or Edward I, but certainly a king with a great many spectacular military successes to his name, and it was and that sort of gets way too much attention in my view. There's a lot more to being a king than military success, but let's go on to him.
Yeah, he didn't, unlike his grandfather, he didn't really suppress peoples to the same extent because his grandfather expelled all the Jews, so there weren't any left. He'd already done the Welsh, so it wasn't quite bad in that sense. He did manage to get the government going well, turned England into a military power, which it needed to be at that time, given the rise of other powers in Europe. I've got this wrong because notable issue, he had lots. If I cross them over, oops. Oh, what happened there? something happened there, and I'm not where I should be. There we go. I should be clicking over here. I was clicking on the StreamYard screen. So he had Edward the. Oh, I must have typed it and deleted it when I thought I was doing Richard. He had Edward the Black Prince, who was a very famous prince who unfortunately died the year before Edward III died, so he never got to be the king. But he did a lot of military success in France. They regained a lot of the lands there, and because of Edward the Black Prince, who led most of the armies there, he managed to secure a lot of the lands, and he laid waste to a lot of them as well. He was not the nicest person at times. But yeah, from a political power point of view, which is the way things happened at this time, he was a very effective person, and everyone was looking forward to him being king, but he didn't make it.
No.
Edward the here we go. So Edward III, he had a lot of children, 8 or so, and that laid the seeds of discontent for the next 200 years, unfortunately. He also, really the 100 Years' War started with John, you could say. It certainly heated up under Edward III.
Yeah, well, Edward III is, the conventional timing is that it started with Edward III, with the naval battle of Sluis, and Edward.
Well, I said John because, I said John because of the reasons. The reason that that the war started is because the French took back all those lands. So,
well, I mean, yes, and you might have thought that, well, they're all French speaking, so perhaps they properly belong in France. Perhaps you could argue that Edward III declaring himself to be King of France was a little bit provocative. But like I say, it was, so the two battles of Poitiers and Crécy,
famous battles.
Well, the Battle of Sluis was also a huge success. It really started well for England, the 100 Years' War, and they absolutely smashed the French armies, and the French, I think, failed in a strategic sense. It's not too much to say that the English were playing an away campaign. They had long supply lines. It was an expensive business to keep them supplied, and there was internal discontent about the cost of the war. So the French could have played more patiently, and rather than insisting on set battles, large set piece battles, they could have just, okay, well, we'll let you ride around for a bit, and you'll have achieved nothing by the end of it. Which gets me back to sort of the less palatable aspect of medieval warfare. We tend to think of medieval warfare as largely taking place on battlefields with between these large armies of knights and what have you, and we tend to set aside the conscriptions, the people who are forced to be on the battlefield, but we also tend not to pay as much attention to chevauchée. Chevauchée was a form of warfare where a large band of mounted soldiery would just rampage across enemy territory, and they basically
tanks of their time.
They were the tanks of their time, but they weren't targeting anything military. They were just burning and looting, and they do these big arcs through enemy territory, and the secret of their success was terror. They were absolutely unstoppable as far as the peasantry of the day were concerned. They couldn't do anything about it. These people were too fast, too brutal, too well armored, and too well organized. And basically, the idea was to carve a trail of carnage through the citizen population of the enemy, and then come back in the outside and keep that up. And it was what sort of the Black Prince became famous doing. He led a couple of very famous chevauchés that turned out to be very successful. But, the cost in terms of, civilian casualties was extremely high. And we shouldn't, we have a tendency to gloss that over when we're discussing military, when we're discussing medieval history, military history. I'll get it right eventually. There is a distinctly immoral cast to the way warfare was waged in these eras. So,
I think part of it was that the nobility saw peasants as their property rather than human beings, and didn't really have a lot of compassion for them. And there were two purposes for the chevauchée: is that one, to get supplies for your own troops, and two, to deny supplies for the enemy. Because if you take all the food and burn and kill all the peasants and burn all the crops, there's not going to be anything left for them. So, the whole Russians and Stalingrad approach to warfare.
Yeah, it's a bit of a salt the fields, etc. But the people of the time regarded it as this is just the way the world is. But there were people who were trying to change that. One of the reasons for the Crusades was the sort of the papacy trying to get people less interested in wandering around and killing peasants and more interested in going off and killing Arabs and Saracens and freeing the Holy Land, which they thought was worthwhile. So there was an awareness of sort of just how bad things had gotten, but nobody was really able to do anything effective about it. But there you go. Start of the 100 Years' War, which actually went a bit longer than that.
130 odd. Yeah.
You'll keep on hearing about it.
And he also had his own pandemic to deal with. The Black Death came through, and about a third of his population were gone. He was killing a lot of them, and the Black Death took another third of them. He was dealing with a lot of things as a king.
The estimates are that the Black Death may have killed up to 50% of the population of Europe, and we're now quite certain that it was Yersinia pestis, human plague, that was at issue, because we've got DNA evidence of that. For a while, we couldn't really close there were a lot of things that didn't fit, a lot of things in the narrative that didn't fit with human plague, but we now know that that's what it was. And it's very difficult to overstate how massive an influence the Black Death. At the time, it was not called the Black Death; it was called the Great Mortality. But this was a huge social impact, and it's worth dwelling on for a few of its consequences. In particular, it made labour suddenly quite valuable.
Yes.
There just weren't as many people. There just weren't as many people around to do work, and it also made agriculture less profitable because there weren't as many people around who needed food. So all of a sudden, the price of food dropped, and the cost of labor rose. And there were a series of laws, some of them quite draconian, based on to try and keep peasants on their land. Like, so if you're the serf of a lord and that lord over there is offering more money, we kind of think it's normal. You get up, you go over to the other lord and you work for them. That's not how medieval nobles saw it. That was their serf. And if he left their land, that was a crime. And it certainly got enshrined as a crime. And nobles could run around claim that other people were runaway serfs and just drag them back to work on their land. There are also laws about how much people could demand as payment for labor to try and keep the costs down. But the reality was that the economy was changing. This old feudal system of large-scale agriculture by serf labor feeding people in the cities suddenly wasn't as profitable as it was anymore, and the people making the money now were actually merchants in cities, and which is one side of the socioeconomic reality post plague. But the other aspect, I think, was spiritual, because everybody died, not just evil people, not just bad people, everybody. There were monasteries that were 100% mortality rate. Priests were dying, nuns were dying, everybody was dying of this. And it became a very difficult problem to solve for the church. Theologically, what's going on here? People are doing what God's telling them to do, but they're dying all the same. And the idea that this is some punishment for the sins of the world, it didn't really wash with a lot of people. There were tragic cases of men who'd had their wives and 6 children carried off by the plague. And you're just going, okay, well, what were the kids punished for? Exactly. Where does this begin to make sense in a theological perspective? And it's about this time that you start getting divergent voices inside the church, that the church itself is now a corrupt institution, and that it was that corruption, that it was because the church was completely lost, that you start to get the seeds for what will later blossom into Protestantism. And interestingly, one of the early voices in that, whose name I can't remember, God damn it, was an Englishman. Fascinatingly, he was dug up after his body was dug up, charged with heresy, and then burnt at the stake. One of the many people who was tried after death for heresy. Can't remember his name. Anyway, sorry, that was a bit of a rant, but
no, it's good. Well, we're trying to get information out of these things, you know.
Yeah.
All right, so
John Wycliffe. John Wycliffe.
Yeah,
that was his name.
So, like I said, Edward III sowed the seeds of troubles for the next few generations, at least, by having so many kids, who also had a lot of kids. And so there's lots of potential claimants for the throne around. So with Edward the Black Prince dying a year before Edward III died, that meant Edward the Black Prince's son Richard came to the throne, and he was only a boy of 9 or so when he came to the throne. So he didn't have a dad, and he didn't know anything else but being king, basically. And he took that to heart. He started believing that he had the right to do everything, and no one could really stop him. And he was, I wonder if that was the beginning of the concept of the divine right of kings, or whether that was around earlier than this. Well, certainly he had that sort of approach to life.
Well, I think that there was a lot of there's a lot of interplay between the church and the church offers validation for the king, saying for the royalty, saying, well, they've been chosen by God, they deserve to be in charge, and the king going, okay, well, you can have tax-free land because you say I should be in charge. So it all works well between those two groups. So I think that divine rule by divine right was a thing, but Richard II certainly took it to the next level. It was he who introduced the royal we. So when you hear mockery of the Queen saying we are not amused, that is Richard II's innovation. He insisted on everything going up to the next level as far as he was concerned. The respect that needed to be shown to royalty in his mind was absolute.
And it didn't extend to family members, because his mother, who Edward the Black Prince was her third husband, and she had children by previous marriages, and he found a reason to execute his stepbrother, Richard's stepbrother, despite the pleas of his mother. So, he's the king. He gets to do it because he's the king.
Yeah, I think when you put it like that, maybe one of the inspirations for Joffrey from Game of Thrones.
Yes.
Just to answer Flo Rider, would human society have Rachel's an idiot. Don't bring that here. Would human society have even survived pestilence if the medieval warm-up period hadn't happened? Well, there's a lot to suggest that actually Europeans have a much higher resistance to a lot of viruses and a lot of bacteria than other racial groups, and it's thought that the Great Mortality, the Black Death, played a role in that, because if you caught it once, you wouldn't catch it again. You were resistant. It's also worth noting that we talk about one Black Death, but actually there were more and more plagues afterwards. And the second one that came along, I think the second one was actually called the Children's Plague, because all of the adults that had survived were pretty much immune, but the kids weren't. So a lot of kids died in the Child's Plague, which again just pounded away at that theological, splintering of what's going on. Yep. Okay.
One positive about Richard II was that, first of all, this image here is the very first image we have of a monarch on their coronation day. It was commissioned by him. We didn't really have images of kings beforehand. We had a lot of effigies, and a lot of the images are shown here are later images that by someone who imagined what they look like. But this is an actual image of what Richard II supposedly looked like on his coronation day. Although the artistry could be a little bit more realistic, I think. But the other positive thing I want to say about Richard II is that he really loved his wife, Anne, and was absolutely heartbroken when she passed away just a few years before he did.
Yeah. The other thing that I want to point out about Richard II is that he was well named because he was a complete dick.
Yep.
And I think that the Peasants Revolt of 1381 illustrates this quite firmly. There was the social tension following on from the Great Mortality was continuing, so there was increased social unrest. There was increased desire for social mobility, to be able to sell labor for what it was actually worth rather than what the government was pretending it was worth, and to just concede that the social circumstances had changed. But the entrenched nobility didn't want to do that, and they insisted that the peasantry should stay in line, do as they're told, and just hand over money when ever Richard wanted to do anything expensive, which was quite often. He was still prosecuting a war against France, though somewhat intermittently. And then there was still occasions of nobles, basically just kidnapping people and saying that they were escaped serfs without having to validate their claim, because they were in charge of the law. They were in charge of the legal system. They implemented it. So, who was going to hold them accountable? And eventually it all came to a head when Richard's ministers decided that the way to raise money was with a poll tax. which is, you may remember the name. It's been tried a couple of times and it's never popular because it basically says everybody in the land has to hand over a pound or whatever, a fixed amount. And it doesn't matter how rich you are, that if you're really, really rich, that's not very much. But if you're poor, that's crippling, that's bankrupting. And the peasants of the day saw the injustice of this. They saw that it was just a raw money grab, and it was basically a big John Rapp welcome to the peasantry of England. It was a big middle finger, and a lot of people just decided that they weren't going to pay it, so they didn't register themselves, and so a bunch of tax inspectors were sent round into the provinces, particularly in Essex, where they behaved abominably. They would wander into towns and they would forcibly molest the women in the towns, claiming that they were inspecting to see whether or not they were virgins, because married women were subject to the poll tax. Unmarried women weren't. So there was basically forcible large-scale sexual assault inflicted by these tax inspectors, and the peasantry didn't like it. They didn't enjoy it, and eventually, some of them protested and ran off, and then came back the next day with some soldiers. As a result of which, the soldiers got surrounded by a mob, beaten to death, and it was off to the races. Now, these protesters were guilty of treason. They had killed the king's men, and so they had nothing to lose. So this basically snowballed into this gigantic peasant rebellion, with armies coming from multiple areas, peasant armies coming from multiple areas, to pincer London. I'll leave Hugh to narrate the rest of the denouement.
All right, so I forget the name of the guy who was their leader, but at Smithfield, Richard met the leaders of the. It was an odd name. I was amazed I can't remember it, but you couldn't remember the other one, John Wycliffe. So he met them, and he was only like 14 at the time, because remember, he was only 9 when he took the throne, and they wanted to. He basically said to them, "I am your captain. You have no other captain but me." To paraphrase, "I am your captain and your king," and so he was able to talk to them, one-on-one with the leaders, and they felt. But then they all dispersed because they thought the king had their interests at heart. And it was kind of the end of the revolt. But after a while, Richard just didn't do anything that he promised, and they realised the gig was up. So they started up again, and then he just went out, sent out his men, and basically killed them all. So that just shows what sort of what we were saying earlier about he thinks he's the king, and he can do whatever he bloody well wants.
Yeah, he was a dick. So the leader you're talking about is Wat Tyler, who was one of the main.
Yes.
Yeah, one of the main leaders. But
they would have had some awkward conversations. What's your name? What? What's your name? What? What's your name? Or what's your name? Yes. What's your name? Yes.
Mm-hmm. So one of the interesting things about this is that the rebels didn't see themselves as rebelling against Richard. They thought that Richard had corrupt advisors, that he was surrounded by corrupt ministers. And what they wanted was for the ministers to be handed over to them, so that they could deal justice, and then they could advise the king on how to rule wisely. Obviously, the king's advisors weren't keen on that particular outcome, and the king was the king was able to sort of defuse the situation for long enough that he could have the leaders of the rebellion executed without having to do anything. So a bit of a dick, I would say, because the peasants had had more than a few decent grievances that he should have paid attention to.
But he couldn't be bothered because he was a king and wanted to do what he wanted. So the Lords Appellant are relevant because one of those was Henry of Bolingbroke, who we will know soon. In fact, we'll go to him now. But he was involved in that peasant revolt in that way. And but at the end of it, Richard basically executed all the Lords Appellant except two, one being Henry, who he exiled for 10 years, and the other one who he exiled for life. And of course, Henry eventually came back and deposed Richard. In fact, we'll move on to Henry now. And he deposed Richard and took him over. Richard was basically starved to death. He was locked in a dungeon and not fed anything. And again, like Edward II, encouraged to die as quickly as possible.
And also like Henry II, he had some political allies and friends that he just wouldn't let go of. De la Pole and De Vere, in particular. He wanted to give them wealth and titles and that sort of thing, and it just wouldn't listen to people who said, well, actually, no, we don't want these people to be in positions. So, as you say, another one of those people who died in confused circumstances.
Yes, and the thing about being in the medieval world and later in the Tudor world, I guess, you don't want people who might have a claim to the throne better than yours anyway, to be around. You basically want them dead, because so that way they can't raise armies and fight against you. That's what they were doing with Richard. They encouraged him to die as quickly as possible. Is probably the nicest way of putting it. But in came the first. Well, no, Richard II was the very first of the Shakespearean kings. Henry IV is actually where I started on Shakespeare, started on that play. And this is where the War of the Roses basically starts. The start, the epilogue, the bit before it starts. It starts with Edward IV, really, well, Henry VI. But they're coming out. So Henry IV, he was yet another usurper of the throne, but supported by all the nobles. Famously, the father of Henry V, probably the second most famous king of all time. Well, yeah, it's toss up. So I think the three most famous kings are Alfred the Great, Henry VIII, and Henry V. So it'd be personal opinion as to which is what sequence it would be in. His reign was his dad was Richard of York, I think, and he had some illegitimate children who were named after the place where most of them were born in France, called Beaufort, and that was the start of the Beaufort family. They'll become relevant later on, and the Nevilles, who are another strong family, and in fact, that one of the Nevilles became one of the queens in a little while. Like I said, Henry IV was one of the Lords Appellant, who the peasants wanted to get rid of. He was exiled by Richard II, but he came back to take the crown. At the same time, had Owain Glyndŵr, I guess you pronounce it. Glyndŵr in Wales, raising a rebellion, probably one of the last ones held in Wales. And then Henry Percy up in the north, Henry Hotspur, he was called. He had a rebellion up there. So Henry IV not only had to fight to get his crown, he had to fight to keep it as well. So he set up things. He was quite young when he died. And Henry V saw Henry IV as an ailing king for the last few years of his reign, and was basically wanting to get more power. It was a bit like the Henry II situation. want to get more power. So, look, you're two not up to the job. Let me take over for a while. But Henry IV didn't want to do that. He had too much of Henry II in him. And he did a little bit more than Henry II in that regard, gave Henry V a bit more. And Henry V famously said to him, presented a dagger to his father and said, slay me down if I'm not 100% loyal to you, basically. And that sort of reconciled the two. Henry IV lost all his sadness about the difficulty he had with his son and embraced him, and they were right until Henry IV died just a few weeks later. So it was nice that he had the reconciliation, but and then Henry V was ready to go. He'd been waiting for it. So anything else we should cover here that you want to talk about Henry IV before we move on?
No, not really.
Yeah, apart from the fact of the way he took his crown, it wasn't a lot there. It was only 14 years, so in fact it was more closer to 13 than 14. But then Henry V, one of the most famous kings of all time from England, that is. Another one who died young, and he had an even shorter reign.
Yes.
When he was like Richard I. When you put yourself out there, you're going to suffer a few setbacks occasionally. Of course, he's famous for Agincourt, where the English, against all odds, defeated the French. The French thought they were going to cakewalk it, and it went the other way. Only a few losses from the English. And as a result of that, they signed a treaty with the French, and Henry was going to marry Catherine, the daughter of the King of France, and therefore Henry's children would be the kings of France. And that sort of wrapped that up in a nice little package. Pity it didn't work out that way, but that's the next one. Henry V, apart from his military campaigns, did a fair bit in government as well. Chancery Standard English came in. That's probably one thing I didn't mention about Henry IV. He was probably the first king at his coronation to give his address in English. It had been all French or Latin before then. And Henry V said, "Okay, we're going to bring in more English into government so that the people can understand."
Henry V introduced English as the language of government. Whereas, as you say, it had been Latin and French before then. So, I mean, it's there is a growing tendency to there's a growing awareness as sort of the 100 Years' War goes on of national identity, which was not really such a big thing. You'll notice early on that the barons would rise up and rebel against the king if they didn't like how things were going. That was not so much a nationalistic thing. It was, well, I'm not doing good out of this, so I'm going to have this. And you'll notice even Henry IV himself, Henry V's dad, he could be argued is just an upstart noble who sees the throne through main force. So, but there is a growing awareness of national identity throughout the 100 Years' War. There's a progression, and English identity is slowly strengthening through this period. It's worth pointing out as well that Agincourt again was a defeat that the French didn't need to have. The French could have avoided this by playing patiently, by just letting the raid play out, because it was basically a disaster. It didn't achieve anything. It didn't. If they just left it alone, Henry would have been forced to go back to England with his tail between his legs. But instead, again, they made the mistake of forcing a battle, and they lost. If only they'd read their Sun Tzu, never force battle unless you've already won. Well,
that was the problem. They thought that they had it in the bag. So
but they famously didn't. So more interesting. Never have a battle if you don't need to, unless you really need to. So anyway.
Apart from Shakespeare play, because Henry wasn't around for very long, there's not a lot more to say except he died of dysentery, which is sort of something a little hard to specify. It seems to be different in different eras, and it's more than just diarrhea. It's a whole lot of maladies, really.
Well, dysentery is lethal, pretty lethal pretty quickly unless you know what the treatment is, and the treatment is quite simple. It's a mixture of water, salt, and sugar, but people didn't know that at the time, and you can dehydrate very, very quickly from dysentery.
Well, there wasn't a lot of sugar for a start. The Americas hadn't been contacted yet. That's where sugar mostly comes from. They had other forms of sugar. They had beets and things like that, I guess. But
yeah, they did have beets, but they were growing sugarcane in the Middle East by this stage. It was one of the inputs that they could get. Sugarcane is not an American. Tomatoes, potatoes, yes. Sugar, no. Sugarcane is an old world crop, but not in Europe.
I was thinking more about all the plantations in the West Indies and things like that, but which became available for Elizabeth I, but not so much at this point. So Henry with Catherine had a son, another Henry VI, who would be the King of France, but it didn't work out that way. He had, I'm amazed. I didn't realize he'd lived so long. He was 49 when he died.
Yeah.
Not a very pleasant death, but we'll get on to that.
Sharp-eyed viewers will notice that there are two reigns there.
Yes.
Already, which gives you an idea.
We cover the next one.
Yeah.
Gives you an idea of.
It gives you an idea of the political instability of this particular era of English history.
Yes, we're well into the War of the Roses now.
Yeah.
Because Henry was a Lancastrian.
It's worth pointing out that the War of the Roses is the inspiration that George R.R. Martin used for the Game of Thrones. So there was a lot of very vicious and ruthless activity through the next few decades. Anyway.
Yep. So Henry VI, his dad died when he was just 9 months old. So he's another one who never knew his dad. So I always think that's unless you've got to have someone who's that sort of figure, especially if you're going to be a king. And he wasn't like his dad at all. He turned out to be more of a scholar and a priest, very pious and very learned. He started Eton. He started King's College in Cambridge and All Souls College in Oxford. So he wasn't interested really in fighting with France so much, but he had to, of course, because the French were fighting with him, especially when he was claiming to be King of France. And of course, the French went back on their treaty, and that became a bugbear for a while. He had one son, but in the rebellions that we'll get on to in a minute, he lost his son about a year before Henry VI himself died. So that line died out. Richard Duke of York is in there. He was the father of the next king we're going to have a look at, Edward IV and Richard III. So we're almost at the end. But also in this period, Margaret Beaufort, we mentioned Henry IV's dad. She's descended from him. And she got married at 13, had a child at 13, got married at 12 to Owen Tudor, who was also married Catherine of Valois, who was the widow of Henry V. I think that's right. Or was it someone else? Yes, it was something like that.
Something like that. But
and then Henry was his son. But Margaret, being 13 years old when she had Henry, never had any more children. She was so damaged from it. So her son was everything to her, and she's like we talked about Eleanor of Aquitaine in the last stream. Margaret Beaufort's the equivalent, one of the most significant women of all time, at least in the history of England. Not only because she's the mother of a king, but because of what she had to go through to get to the point to make her son a king, because he didn't have a very strong claim. He was the last of the Lancastrians. In fact, Henry VI sort of smiled on him as the next as a successor to him if his own son didn't turn out at one point. So Margaret was very good at diplomacy, and she was very good at being married to the right person too. That saved her a lot.
Tudor as a surname is originally Welsh, I believe.
Tudor.
Yeah. So it's interesting that it's interesting to me that sort of a prominent Welsh family rose to such heights, but that how Welsh they were by this stage in their development is a bit of an open question. But I don't know much about Henry VI except that he was a man ill-suited to the circumstances that he found himself in.
That's a good way of putting it.
He didn't have the ruthlessness, or the military skills, or the diplomatic skills of any of the people he was competing against, and it showed. If I were forced to speculate about who his dominant figures were, I would suggest that it was somebody in the church, that he had a tutor as a child who was an important cleric, and he came out very dedicated to spiritual aspects and education, the importance of learning, etc., which seems to have dominated his thinking, but really. It didn't serve him or his lineage that well, his fixation. Anyway, let's move on.
Well, the other thing to note about his reign is that he checked out for a year. He basically went into a stupor and was unresponsive for an entire year. He didn't even notice that his son had been born, which physicians these days still argue over what might have caused that, because it's a very strange thing to happen. I wish I could just go to work and say, look, I'm just going to switch myself off for a year and have my job at the other end of it, but it works for kings, apparently.
It works for kings, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it was amazing. But yeah, it's amazing because it's the only king that it ever happened to. It seems there was something wrong with him, but no one will ever know what it was. But whether it was psychological or physiological, who knows? But so the reason there's two slots of reign here, and the second one is only 6 months. It was the end of October to April, is because of the next fella, Edward IV, and who led a rebellion and was successful, and reigned for nearly 10 years with Henry VI in jail. And then the Richard of York I was talking about before. Sorry, no, not Richard. Not that Richard of York. Warwick, I'm talking about, who was a Neville, was known as a kingmaker. He kept switching sides between Edward and Henry because whatever suited his needs. And that's how Henry got back for 6 months. But after that, Edward came back, decisively got rid of Henry, and they reckon he was murdered in the Tower of London. Henry VI, that is, was murdered in the Tower of London on Edward's orders. And like I said earlier, if you've got a potential rival to your throne, you get rid of them. There's no point having them around.
Now, well, I mean, part of it, Henry VI's position was, of course, compromised by the fact that he had a French wife, and things were going very badly in the war against France, and England was losing territories hand over fist, which, this is the era, I think, of Joan of Arc. Basically, there was a widely accepted narrative that Henry VI was too meek and his wife was running affairs to the benefit of France. Whether or not that is the case, it was accepted as desirable that he not be in charge of the country anymore. So anyway, wanted to put that in.
Yeah, and the barons agreed, and Edward IV, who had a claim to the throne, he was a usurper, but he still had a claim, was brought in, and he had a troubled reign. Margaret Beaufort tried to ingratiate herself with him and was successful, and had to do it all over again with Henry VI when he came back, and then 6 months later had to go back the other way again, trying to protect her son, of course, because he owned lands and things like that. Women weren't allowed to own lands back in those days; that a man had to own it, and it was only because of her marriages to powerful men that she was able to survive, and the future Henry VII was able to survive as well. But there's a lot more to that story, but that's for another time. So Elizabeth Woodville was Edward IV's queen. The Woodville family got power as a result of this union, and Edward married her without telling anyone else. People weren't very happy, especially Warwick, which was a major reason they had a falling out. They were best buddies, and then because Warwick was going out trying to find a queen or a princess somewhere in Europe, so they had a good military alliance, because that's the way kings and queens happened in those days. It wasn't about love or anything like that. It was about what was best for the nation. And so Warwick was a bit pissed off that Edward didn't do what he told him to do, so that's why he threw in with Henry. And Richard Neville was that's Earl of Warwick I'm talking about. So his issue was Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, the princes in the Tower, which is the next slide. So we'll get into that. Edward IV was accused of being illegitimate, and you might have seen the Tony Robinson special where they explore if Edward IV was illegitimate, who would have been the rightful king of England. And they found a guy in Australia who's now passed away. I guess his son's the rightful heir now. But I think the rumours were spread by Richard III to discredit Edward IV more than anything else, because Richard, well, we'll get into that. We'll get into Richard. Yes. But Edward IV, he wasn't a particularly bad king. He didn't do, he continued the wars, had a few rebellions to put down, but didn't go out of his way to make the peasants' lives hell or anything like that, as other kings did.
He was in an extremely difficult political situation. He had powerful allies he had to appease, who could turn against him on a dime.
As Neville did.
He had powerful enemies that he needed allies to defend himself against. So it was, the entire position was politically very unstable and very prone to, very difficult to navigate successfully. It's difficult to be too harsh on him. There's no obvious winning strategy from the position that he was placed in. And
plus being a usurper, he was constantly trying to justify the validity of his reign. And then he had all the foreign things he had to deal with and everything. So he had two sons, and one of them was Edward, another one was Richard. And when Edward IV passed away, his brother Richard III, who had been a very loyal subject of Edward IV, he supported Edward in pretty much everything. The Sun Express. I had a license plate on my car in Chicago with the letters Hugh Jarsz for 2 years. Okay. Thank you very much for the $20 super chat. I very much appreciate that. Nice. And that was worth the chuckle, that's for sure. Okay. I don't know what that's got to do with me, but yes, it's funny. Yeah. So Richard III, the obvious choice to be Lord Protector while the princes were young. Edward was just 12 years old when his dad passed away. So Edward gave Richard basically control of the north of England. So he trusted Richard that much. Richard was very loyal to his brother, and his brother reciprocated. But when Edward died, Richard rode hard to get controlled the personage of the king, who was in the guardianship of the king's uncle, who was one of the Woodvilles. And the Woodvilles were much like the Despensers, were much hated by the other nobility. So because they thought they were upstarts and they didn't deserve to be there. So Richard took personage of the king because, hey, I'm Lord Protector, so that's something I've got to do. Took him to the tower for safekeeping, and they were never seen again. And it can never be proven one way or another. 2 skeletons of about the right age were found a century later or so in the tower, but it's never been proven if they were them or someone else, because lots of people live in the tower. The speculation is that Richard had them murdered, or someone, a bit like in the Henry II and Thomas Becket, might have thought that was what the king wanted, so they did that.
This is where there's a lot of revisionist history that drives me to annoyance. If you look at Richard III's career, Richard III would ally himself with people, then turn on them, accuse them of treason, and kill them.
Certainly from this point, yes.
Yeah. So, from the point where his brother died, he seemed to have no loyalty whatsoever to these kids or their family. Elizabeth Woodville spent something like a year in a church
in Westminster Abbey, sanctuary.
Afraid to come out because she thought that Richard III would have her killed. And Richard III, that would have been true to character for Richard III. He lied and backstabbed and executed former allies on trumped-up charges willy-nilly. As soon as people outlived their usefulness to him, they were done. And he seems to have been a completely mercenary and unscrupulous man. And to say that he wouldn't have killed the princes in the tower for whatever reason, some people argue, well, his claim to the throne didn't depend on the princes of the tower. He claimed that his brother was illegitimate. That is post facto rationalization, claiming that he could tell that killing the princes in the tower would ultimately be bad for him politically, which it turned out to be. But he had no way of knowing that. And it would have been perfectly rational for him to kill the princes in the tower. It had happened with Richard II. It had happened with Edward II. It was just standard procedure.
Henry VI.
It is by far the most likely and plausible explanation. And while you can weave all sorts of convoluted skeins of conspiracy through it, it was him. He did it. I don't have much time for people who come along and try and reinterpret history in order just to be contrarian. I understand the temptation to do it, but no. In this case, Shakespeare was pretty much right. Not 100%, but pretty much. Richard III, as his name suggests, was a complete dick. So
absolutely.
Let's
move on to him.
Yes.
So we've talked a little bit about what he did to. The first step towards the throne was to get rid of his nephews. The next step was to say that they should never have been king in the first place. Well, Edward should never have been king. Mm-hmm. And to that effect, at St. Paul's, he had a leading clergyman, because most of the communication came through the church out to the general public. Mm-hmm. And at St. Paul's, the old cathedral, not the one that Christopher Wren did a couple of hundred years later, did this little play act where the clergyman was saying, Edward IV was illegitimate, his mother was unfaithful, although there's no evidence of that because, there is speculative evidence, which is what Tony Robinson was on about. But, I mean, that queen of of his, not the queen, the wife of his father, she went on to have 8 more kids. And if you are prone to adultery, you don't go and have 8 kids with the same guy. It doesn't work that way, even in those times. So it was weird. I don't think it was likely that he was illegitimate, but it suited Richard's purposes, as did killing his nephews. This is cutthroat politics, really, literally. And that's the way it was in the medieval times. It wasn't just in England, it was elsewhere on the continent as well. So Richard had 2 rebellions to put down, one which he succeeded in and one which he didn't, which was the Battle of Bosworth Field. And that's where he fought Henry Tudor, who came back from exile. Oh, we should mention, we were saying about Elizabeth Woodville being in sanctuary because of Richard. Margaret Beaufort was in there with her. And they became good friends, and they shared a physician between them, and they were able to get messages out to Henry through him. And so Margaret basically planned the invasion of England by Henry Tudor and his forces, from being locked in at Westminster Abbey. She even sent him money and things like that, so he could buy troops and arms and things. So eventually Henry landed in Wales, because that's going to be symbolic, because he's trying to claim ancestry back to Alfred the Great through Wales. And he came to Bosworth near Lincoln, and they had a big battle, and Richard went very close to winning. He certainly had the numbers, but because of Margaret Beaufort's husband at the time, Lord Stanley, who was a third army watching what was going on, he came in on Henry's side, and that turned the battle, and Richard lost. And of course, the Shakespeare, a horse, my kingdom for my horse, he probably lost a few horses in that battle. And he said, "This day I will be king, or I will die like one." And that's exactly what happened. He died like one. He was not, if he was anything, he was definitely brave. So yeah, probably C+ is a bit generous. I probably meant to put D+.
Yeah.
He did sort out some administration, but he was a dick.
Yeah, he was a dick. The number of people who worked alongside him, and he said, "Oh, yeah, I'll just arrest him, but I won't execute them." But then he'd turn around and he'd execute them at the drop of a hat. He was clearly murderous when the whiff of political advantage was offered to him. So I don't see any reason to doubt the suggestion that he killed the princes in the shower. Ultimately, it's a mystery that's unlikely to be definitively solved. But it's just such, there's nothing that doesn't fit in that narrative. There's no reason to second guess it, and it fits very, very well. If you look at Richard III's career, he was an unscrupulous, lying, murderous cunt. Sorry, Hugh, but I'm going to say it like that. And a dick, yes.
Yes, at the same time. How about that?
Yeah, that's right.
So we finally got to the third dick, and the final thing to talk about, I think, is Richard III, after the Battle of Bosworth Field. According to the skeleton they found, he had like 53 penetration points. So they sort of hoed right into him after they killed him. Yeah. Because everyone would just say they stuck a king. And they took him up to Lincoln Cathedral and buried him there. For a long time, history recorded that he was thrown into the river and no one knew where he was buried, but he was just buried in a secluded part of the cathedral that was there. It was the cloisters of a monastery, which Henry VIII knocked down. So the burial site was lost. But then in 2012, someone from the Richard III Society, yes, there is a thing, led a expedition to exhume where they thought the body was. And in the first trench on the first day, they found him, which was amazing because he had scoliosis of the spine. I hope I pronounced that correctly. So he's very distinctive skeleton. He had a big curve in his spine.
Well, they were also able to identify him genetically.
Yes, so that was the follow-up.
Yep.
Yeah. And he's one of the few monarchs for which we have a genetic code, because most of the remains of the royal family are not allowed to be tampered with in that way.
Yeah, so it's a fascinating that we were able to find him based on the historical record. That sort of convergence is very rare indeed, truly remarkable. In the Battle of Bosworth Field, the story goes that Richard, who was quite an accomplished soldier, saw that the battle was going against him, and then he and his immediate entourage started making a beeline for Henry Tudor, trying to kill him. Maybe the battle would be lost, but at least this rival line would be eliminated. And it was in the course of doing that he and his entourage were, succumbed and were cut to bits. That's the way the narrative is written, and it seems to have been true. And there was a lot of hatred. You can kind of tell from there seems to have been a sword stuck in his butt, buttock or up his anus, something like that. And very people didn't like him, or the victors didn't like him, understandably perhaps. But couldn't have happened to a nicer guy, in my opinion. Not that the Tudors went on to show themselves completely upstanding citizens in their own right, but
definitely not. No, but what you were saying, it was true. Well, according to Blackadder, Richard III had his head cut off by Lord Blackadder, and Richard IV came to the throne. So what happened then? I don't know what happened. Brian Blessed himself.
Yes, well, there are
Prince Edward.
There are some remarkable options. I was playing a video game today where the first unifier of Japan in the late 16th century, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, turned out in the video game to not be dead. That would have changed history.
He got better, right?
Yeah, he got better. But
Totally a flesh wound.
There were demons involved and all sorts of things, but but they did manage to get a decent amount of the actual historical narrative in there. There's a lot of similarities, in fact, to the unification of Japan, but that's for another time, I think.
It is. What would you like to do next? Would you like to go back to the Anglo-Saxons or what?
We can discuss that offline. Actually, maybe people in the comments can let us know if there's anything they particularly want to hear about it.
Yeah, I can't really help you with Japan, but Scotland or Anglo-Saxons, we can talk through that.
Yep, Vikings,
so, yes.
Celts.
The Pictic kings as well.
Yes.
So if you'd like us to do more of this, please leave a comment below and let us know what you'd like us to have a look at next. Apart from that, I think we'll wrap up for tonight. So if you like this video, please give it a like, especially if you're in the chat. In fact, we got 18 likes and only 16 watching, so that's great. Always good to have more likes than people watching. That means people have come and gone, so appreciate you leaving the like. If you don't like it, click the dislike button. It's all the same. It helps the algorithm. We appreciate the Sun Express for his super chat and all those who have ever contributed to me. I appreciate that very much. And I don't know why I'm struggling for words. I normally have this down pat. I don't know when my next video is going to be. It will be within the next week or so. You got anything coming up, Tony?
I am working on a video about climate denialism, and I'm hoping to have that out within the next week, provided that my health improves. Like I say, today was a bad day, but maybe the rest of the week will be good.
All right. Well, I hope so. I hope so. All the best to you. All right, then. So I appreciate you being my guest. Thank you very much for doing that yet again.
Thank you for hosting me. I very much appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been good again. We finally got through to the third dick. We were trying to do that the first one, so we were ambitious, weren't we?
Yeah, we were ambitious.
Yes. Well, that's good. But yeah, we'll look at something else next time. So I guess there's nothing left to do. So let's play the outro. So there's nothing left to do but cue the corgi.
You're despicable.